much. And we have also Eugene Iredale as a presenter, and he is muted now, but there he is. And now we are officially starting. We are recording this Zoom event. Welcome to the sounding board. My name is NELLIEHIGH Iredale. I'm the sounding board chair. This is Oceanids' 68th year, which is an official support group of the university. The sounding board is a joint effort of the faculty club and Oceanids. Our honorary chair is Testin Kavulakis, associate of the chancellor, and our president, Nigella Hilgert. In Oceanids, we raise money for grants and awards for students, support other UCSD events and activities, such as the student-run free clinic. We offer many events for our members, and sounding board is one of these events. We are happy to see you via Zoom. It's possibly that this is our one before the last Zoom meeting, and now we're going back to the faculty club, hopefully. And we have this meeting every first Thursday of the month throughout the academic year, except for January. Now, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Eugene Iredale. A little about him. Eugene Iredale is an honors graduate of Columbia College and Harvard Law School, and has been in private practice for over 40 years. Gene has lectured all over the United States on trial practice, having taught at the National Criminal Defense College. Gene has been listed for over 35 years in Best Lawyers of America. And well, the most important thing is that he's my husband, and I think he's a very, very interesting person and a very good human being. He would talk to us about the subject of his presentation is we need a new sheriff in town. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I have to share with you that from time to time I have listened to recordings of the presentations, and I'm impressed not only with the quality of the speakers, but with the intelligence and generally the good looks of the spectators and participants. And I can see today that that holds hopefully true, at least for the latter and maybe for the former. We'll see. What I wanted to talk about today was an issue that has to do with our county and what is really a civic disgrace, and that is the conditions in the county jail, which have resulted, unfortunately, in the highest death rate for any major county in the entire state of people who are brought into the county jail and who remain there pending the outcome of their case. We are going to be having an election, a primary election in June of this year, and then a runoff election in November to elect a new sheriff. To let you know the status, because of the high numbers of death, certain legislators in the state assembly requested that the auditor, the state auditor, conduct an audit of the conditions and the procedures in the San Diego County Jail because of the high death rate. The death rate in our jail in the year 2021 involved the deaths of 18 people. Unfortunately, in San Diego County, at least, you are more likely to get the death sentence for an arrest for drunk driving than you are if you kill 2 or 3 people in an ordinary and not especially vicious way. That is because of the conditions in the jail. The state audit was conducted to determine what were the reasons for this much higher rate of death in the San Diego County Jail for people who come in. And the auditor issued a report which was said by most of the commentators and the news outlets to be a scathing report on the 3rd of February of this year. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, the 3rd of February was the last day of the tenure of the current sheriff, who resigned at least 8 months before the expiration of his term. The reason, he said, I think, is that he wanted to spend more time with his family. It's interesting that public officials who are subject to intense scrutiny oftentimes find a sudden love for familial association to account for an early departure. In any event, the sheriff resigned and the report was released, and they criticized the jail and said that the legislature should act because it was to the auditor questionable as to whether, in the absence of legislation, adequate conditions of safety would pertain in the county jail. The auditor faulted the sheriff for 3 things. One is a failure to have adequate intake. In other words, when somebody is arrested in the jail and they're brought in, they're subject to screening. And many people who are arrested have issues concerning drug or alcohol abuse, health issues, and psychological problems. That's just the nature of the population that's in the jail. And the auditor said that the screening appeared to be inadequate to give notice of the medical issues or problems that needed to be dealt with for the people who were being brought into the jail. The second thing the auditor said was that the medical care that was rendered was sporadic and failed to involve the coordination of information so that the treater could appropriately give care. And then the third thing that was mentioned specifically in the auditor's report was the failure of adequate checks, safety checks, or surveillance of people who are in the cells and who from time to time have seizures, become unconscious, or sustain falls, which went undetected because typically the cell checks were not done in an appropriate way or at appropriate intervals. In addition, the state auditor in its report faulted the board that is supposed to provide oversight and to give some transparency to the public about failures of the administration of the Sheriff's Department. And that is called by the acronym CLRB, which stands for County Law Enforcement Review Board. CLRB exists, but unfortunately it's entirely toothless. It does not have the subpoena power, which means it can't compel witnesses to appear before it or to give a statement to an investigator. It is not permitted to be on scene, or at least as of that point, it wasn't permitted to be on the scene when there was a death in the jail or a death that may occur outside in connection with patrol activities of the Sheriff's Department. And it was grossly understaffed and underfunded because, for example, there were some 15 deaths in the jail which were supposed to be investigated, but because CLRB lacked the resources, they could not do the investigations in time and specifically announced that they were not going to investigate any of the circumstances of 15 separate fatalities that occurred in the jail. Now, because I am going to say some things that are, to my mind, serious critiques, I also think I should put in context the problems of the Sheriff's Department, not only in this county, but throughout the United States. Unfortunately, many of the societal problems which had previously been dealt with by other institutions, such as state mental hospitals, such as properly funded drug programs, have not done their job. And so the county jail becomes, among other things, the mental hospital of last resort. About 35 to 40% of the people in the county jail have diagnosable and serious mental problems that have gone untreated and that have sometimes led to them being there because of their psychiatric or psychological problems. And thus, as the former sheriff liked to say, in a tone of braggadocio that I think was probably unmerited, but was factually nonetheless true, our county jail is the largest psychiatric treatment facility in the whole county of San Diego. Employs more therapists or mental health professionals, and certainly treats more people, albeit on an interim and insufficient basis, than any other institution in the county. Because of problems of homelessness, crimes that have to do with minor delicts that arise from somebody's not having a home, such as being in the wrong place on the sidewalk, obstructing a thoroughfare, engaging in loud noise. They have resulted in also contributions to a substantial part of the county jail. And then finally, there's the issues of substance abuse, which regrettably is prevalent throughout among people who are in and out of the jail. But every survey that's been done shows that well above 80% of the men and 80% of the women who are arrested are, if not under the influence of drugs, have controlled substances in their system. The primary one, unfortunately, in San Diego is methamphetamine, which is something that's a very serious problem. And so, in fairness to the institution of the sheriff, it has to be noted that the sheriff is, by default, now asked to deal with public policy concerns related to issues of homelessness, issues of failures of the general polity to provide adequate mental health treatment, and certainly to provide bed space for people who need hospitalization for mental health problems. And then finally, for the issues of drug abuse. So I don't in any way mean to unfairly criticize, but having said that, we also have to note that our sheriff's department has a budget of $1 billion. And for the last 15 years, at least, it has been plagued by the worst kinds of inertia and apathy in failing to take care of the health concerns of the people who are put in the jail and who are the responsibility of the sheriff to take care of. So that there have been multiple surveys and audits of the jail by various agencies. One was called Disability California, which said that because of its procedures, there was an unreasonable risk for people in the jail who are subject to suicidal ideation to actually kill themselves. They did a report making specific recommendations for changes in the way the procedures work, the policies work, the screening works, the housing works. At least in part, that resulted in some minor changes, albeit not in a substantial reduction in the rate of suicides in the jail. There was an agency, and I don't mean to get into the alphabet soup, it's called NCCHC. It's an agency that accredits jails for their facilities, and specifically their health facilities. And our jail at one time, approximately 6 years ago, said, well, what we're going to do is to have a review and an audit by this accrediting agency, and that will help guide us into what we have to do. That survey took place, the audit was published, recommendations were made, and the sheriff then said, well, we're going to go in a different direction. Fired the official within the department who had suggested this and went on doing exactly what the sheriff was doing. Now, we are a beautiful place to live. And our population is so far not that of Los Angeles, but at least in one statistic, San Diego County is able to lead the nation. Do you know how many people died in all of the jail facilities in New York City last year? 14. That was a very high number for them. But at least in this regard, despite our experiences with the San Diego Chargers and the San Diego Padres and the lamentable prospects of the Aztecs this year in basketball, we can at least say in one respect, we're number one. We led in jail deaths because we beat New York City with a population of nearly 3 times that of our county. We beat them by 4 fatalities. We had 18 deaths in the county jail. Here, I also want to say something in order to be fair to the sheriff's department, and that is that some of the population that they have is going to have problems that no matter how good the vigilance, the concern, and the medical care, people are going to die. And that's just a fact. And so not all of those deaths can be attributed to negligence or apathy. Unfortunately, we have some serious experience with many of them because our office right now is handling 5 separate lawsuits involving deaths of people in the jail, which we have alleged and we believe will be able to prove in court took place because of deliberate indifference to serious medical needs. Some of the cases are tragic. In one case, a man who was schizophrenic was outside his mother's house, and he had an overdue library book. He wanted her to take him to the library, and she said, that's fine, but you're acting a little crazy, you're off your medication. And so his response, of course, was entirely rational. He took some newspapers and set fire to the newspapers in her driveway. So she called the police. She said, look, could you send out a mental health team, a psychological emergency response team? He's off his medication, and I need you, if you would, to put a 72-hour hold on him, bring him to county mental health so he gets his medication and he doesn't harm himself and he doesn't get in trouble. The sheriffs responded, and they assessed that he was not gravely mentally disabled or a danger to himself, but they said he's under the influence of methamphetamine. She said, well, he hasn't taken any meth that I know of, and this is how he acts when he's off his medication. So they took him to the jail. And even though certain of his symptoms, for instance, the pupil of the eye, when somebody's under the influence of a stimulant, it is dilated. But when somebody's under the influence of something else, it's constricted. So they noted in the police report, his pupils are constricted, which they wouldn't have been had he been under the influence of a stimulant. They put him in jail, and they have something called book and release. So for low-level, under the influence offenses, nobody is really prosecuted unless it's very serious. The person is simply held till they sober up and then they're released. And in most of those cases, that's the end of it. But this person, for whatever reason, got lost. And so instead of being released after 8 hours, which is normally what happened, he was held for 24 and then 30 hours. And because he was schizophrenic and moreover diabetic, he began to decompensate. And at the end of that decompensation, when he was asked questions, instead of answering, he just rolled around on the floor like an animal. And so the sheriffs felt at this point that the important thing to do was to get him to a hospital. But in order to do so, they used the following force. To get him out of his cell, they tasered him 3 times. After they soaked him in water, then they threw him to the floor, held him down after he said 5 times he couldn't breathe, and then were surprised when he stopped breathing. And of course, went into a coma and died 2 weeks later when resuscitation had failed and when his life was being maintained only through a breathing apparatus. In another case, there's actually been a criminal case initiated against one of the nurses in the county jail because a woman who was pregnant and who was undergoing drug withdrawals was placed in an isolation cell, and she began having seizures. After she had a seizure and fell to the floor in the presence of the nurse, she continued to seize and to shake. And as a result, she fell unconscious. While she was on the floor, the nurse having seen those seizures, the nurse then walked away and didn't come back for an hour. In the interim, there's a video in the cell, and it shows that this woman stopped moving. And then you see a yellow pool, urine spreading on the floor beside her because she had died because of the failure to care for her when she was undergoing withdrawal, and because after she had this seizure, nobody saw to her or brought her to the hospital. There are case after case after case like this. Part of the issue is fiscal. The sheriff has in the past retained a staff of nurses, but hired private agencies to provide the physicians, the doctors, and the psychiatrists. As a consequence, in order to save money, they put it out for bids. So private entities, normally run by doctors who have experience in providing health care, private entities hire people in order to make the lowest bid to get the contract with the sheriffs. And so the practitioners who work for them, given the salaries that are offered by these private companies that contract with the sheriff, are either new doctors who don't have a practice, or doctors who are at the ends of their career and don't really have the joy in their work, or doctors who have a marginal practice and are willing to work for less than a competitive salary. And so repeatedly, we've seen this pattern. There's a 2-year contract given to this company that provides the physician. The physicians then commit medical malpractice leading to serious injury or death. The sheriff then, when the sheriff is subject to litigation or being sued, they name the private company and sue them, And then they say, well, you're not doing a good job, fire them, and then engage in the same competitive bid process in order to get the low bidder to provide another 2 years of physician services at rock bottom price. Well, this seeming economy is actually illusory because the public fisc ends up paying double or triple what it should in damage awards. Now, although it's not a jail case, our sheriff's department was recently hit by a verdict in the federal court, a huge verdict, $85 million verdict in connection with a wrongful death of a person. And it shows that the unfortunate lack of competence that has plagued the maintenance of the jail is not only in that portion of the sheriff's office, but that at least a part of the county councils may bear discovery, because the county council had a wrongful death case. These were the facts. A man had gone to a concert and taken a drug he was told was ecstasy, MDMA. He'd never done that before. He was a straight person, employed, and he was befuddled, came home, and for whatever reason, for 3 days and nights, could not get to sleep, thought he was going crazy. So he called the sheriff's office and said, I'm afraid I'm going to hurt myself or do something to my family. Please help me. Sheriffs came, and when they, instead of just talking to him first, they wanted to handcuff him. When he pulled his hand away, a fracas began. He was thrown to the ground, tased, restrained. And then he was put in an ambulance when he went unconscious. And he came to, and the deputy in the ambulance put what's called a spit sock on his head, which restricted his breathing, and it put force on his back. And he ultimately died, they believe, of positional asphyxia because he wasn't able to properly breathe. So the family was upset. A wrongful death suit was filed. In the interim, between the death of this man in 2015 and the trial, the deputy who had put on the spit sock and held him down as he struggled in the ambulance to breathe happened to have been himself convicted of a crime because he was alleged to have sexually assaulted or improperly touched some 16 separate women with whom he came in contact during his duties. And it turns out that he was one of the major witnesses at the case. He was only doing 5 years and only had to plead to 4 of those 16 counts. But when he tried to minimize what he had done, the judge, concerned that a false impression was being given to the jury, said, no, you can now at least bring out that on a particular date, he assaulted a member of the public. So in this wrongful death case, the county's main witness was somebody who was required to say, on June the 15th of 2016, I assaulted a member of the public. Now, the judge wanted to be kind to the county, so she said, why don't we make it's just an assault, not a sexual assault? That will eliminate the prejudice. Well, the jury was legitimately outraged. Whether that amount of the verdict will stand is questionable. It's highly likely, given the range of verdicts in these cases, which are generally between $100,000 and $4 or $5 million, the judge will reduce that. But the conduct of the litigation itself, to say nothing of the underlying conduct, is an indication that we have a serious need to have deep and thoroughgoing reform at all levels of the sheriff's department. Now, we have an election coming up, and I don't want to reveal my political background. I'm a Democrat, and I don't want to say who I favor, but there are 4 candidates who are running. One candidate, Kelly Martinez, is the ordained choice of the former sheriff, Sheriff Gore. And I think probably in order to get Gore out of office as soon as possible, certain members of the county supervisor's office and the local political establishment said, we back her. And because she's Gore's ordained choice, she is in the race and she'll be running in November, well, if she gets through the June primary. She, however, is no longer the acting sheriff because the Board of Supervisors, and this is very decent, decided that it wouldn't be fair to have an acting sheriff running for sheriff. So they have appointed an interim acting sheriff who's not running for election, who's a caretaker. The second candidate is John Hemmerling, who is a deputy city attorney. He has a background in the city attorney's office, and he is the Republican Party's choice. Even though nominally the office of sheriff is a nonpartisan office. The Democratic Party has endorsed Dave Myers, who was a candidate for sheriff 4 years ago in 2018, and who had on his own decided to take on Sheriff Gore because of his concern with certain of the problems I've talked about, as well as others having to do with management issues. And then finally, there is a deputy named Ron Newman, who is a deputy sheriff who's running. He is not well known and is not considered to be one of the three major contenders. I don't want to tell anybody how to vote, but I think with this as a background, it is important that everybody in this group, as a matter of civic conscience and decency, weigh in and exercise their franchise, because the way we treat people who are the least among us is sometimes considered to be the measure of what kind of a society we have. That's nothing I uttered. The original sentiment was made by a conservative British politician named Winston Churchill. I think I have said all I need to say, but I'd welcome any comments, questions, or observations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, Jim. Thank you very much. And now I will be changing the view for gallery. You can either raise your hand. This is a small group, so I can see you, or you can do it digitally. I know that probably Mary Hanson, she's always involved in politics and voting. If she has a question, or anybody else would like to ask a question or a comment, please go ahead. Janet, yes. Can you unmute yourself, please? Let's see, I'm trying to.
Okay.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. My son is finishing an MSW at San Marcos, and he's in his internship is with a drug recovery program in half of the people are there because they have been sent by their parole officers, and the other half are HIV people that have come from a different agency. So everything you said is congruent with what he comes home and tells me about his clients. They're in many cases, in most cases, trapped in the life that they grew up with. They don't understand a bigger, larger life. And he thinks his job is to help them expand their world and understand how, by getting straight and staying out of jail, not getting any more felonies, they can succeed. And apparently, in the case of this particular organization, They have a 1/3 success rate, which is considered very good. So I'm certainly happy to hear your presentation. And when he finishes in May 20th, he'll have time to watch it on the archives. So thank you so much for this
Very good.
breakdown of what's going on.
Well, may I just ask you, what's the agency or the program for which he's working?
It's called Choices, and it's Choices for something. It's in either Vista or San Marcos, that sort of black hole where I don't know where anything is. There's no two streets that are north and south or west and east. And it's a residential program, and there are 6 or 7 houses, and they do 3 lectures, or I can't remember the exact word, every day. And he does a couple a week because he's just a beginner, but he's not much of a rule follower. So if they want to interrupt him, that's fine. If he just lets them, he helps them, he coordinates things for them. He doesn't stand on any ceremony. But if you'd like, I'll send you some information about it when he gets home.
Well, that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, sure. You're welcome.
Thank you, Janet. Any other questions or comments?
I have one.
Go ahead, please.
The Sheriff's Department, as I understand it, this is the San Diego County Sheriff's Office. Now, I heard at a local political club 4 years ago when Mr. Myers was running, he came and made a presentation at our club. And at that point, I asked him, because he was talking about the severity of mental illness of the inmates. I asked him what percentage of the inmates were suffering from mental illness. At that time, he said 70%. Now, when he decided to run for the sheriff's office, Sheriff Gore must have seen that as a challenge and found a way to punish him within the department. He was a deputy for a long time in the county sheriff's department. But, and at that time, around that time, we were having an outbreak of, I think, hepatitis A. And the county supervisors, I think all Republican at that time, were not vaccinating anyone, either in the jail or among the homeless. I mean, I see part of this problem as where is the oversight of the health department of the county over the county jail? Don't they have any power or responsibility in all this?
Well, I would think that absolutely they do. Unfortunately, you're Miss Scott, right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, there are a couple of things that I should mention. First is that regrettably, because of the structure of the law, the sheriff's department has considerable independence from the Board of Supervisors. Now, the Board of Supervisors has to fund, and they have to authorize settlements for lawsuits or arrange to litigate those things.
What law would that be?
It is the charter that sets up the position of sheriff.
And what is the salary of the county sheriff?
You know what? I should know that. I believe it's about $200,000 a year. There's another thing, actually, can I say something that's gossipy and a little interesting?
Of course.
No.
Yes.
No,
I don't go for gossip.
This is too high level of a discussion, and you're too intellectually engaged at a grand level for me to engage in that sort of thing.
Tell
But
us.
If you want, there is a website called Transparency California. And on that, you can look up the salaries of almost any public official in the state. And not only high-level public officials, but people who are working as deputy sheriffs, as nurses. We have a case right now where we were brought in and suffice it to say, the poor woman was suffering from a head injury that should have been apparent to anybody. And then she fell from a bunk that was 4 feet high onto a cement floor and hit her head. And the doctor, instead of sending her for hospitalization or emergency care, said, keep an eye on her. And about 18 hours later, she had a seizure, and now she's in diapers and unable to feed herself for the rest of her life. And so we looked up the nurses that dealt with her during that time. And the salaries of these nurses, I thought that nurses were underpaid and it's terrible. If you include base salary, overtime, and benefits, the lowest salary of any of the nurses who dealt with this woman was $170,000 a year. And one nurse had made $220,000 that year. Now, mind you, it includes overtime and it includes benefits, including pension benefits, which won't be realized for many years. But that's, to my mind, compensation that's adequate to be able to have a qualified staff hired to do the work.
Right.
And now, apropos of what you said, Ms. Scott, I have to tell you, I do not know the authority of the county health department vis-a-vis the jails. We do have, though, as I had mentioned, something called CLRB, the County Law Enforcement Review Board, which is supposed to review at least the conduct, not necessarily the medical personnel, but at least of the deputies and the sworn staff. And they have been deprived of the resources and the legal wherewithal to do any job of adequate oversight. But I take your point. It also is something of note that people who get sick in the jail, when they're released, they come out into the community. So it's not simply an issue of confining poor health to a limited space. It's an issue also of making sure that there's adequate care so that a lot of people outside don't get the hepatitis, which, by the way, killed 150 people during that time. 150 people died from those hepatitis outbreaks.
Well, the question behind my question is, in a representative democracy, what recourse is there when the people who are elected and entrusted with enforcing the law flout the law?
Well, there are.
It just becomes a theater, you know. Shakespeare was right. It just becomes a dog and pony show.
Well,
where's the reality?
There are 3 things. One is, to the extent that there are, in fact, real choices to be made, I'm going to say it, vote for Dave Myers. I've given him money. I support him 100%. He's somebody who at least has expressed a desire to change the public policy, to put more attention and money into medical care and to do the right thing. And when I to a certain extent, it's against my economic self-interest because we have major lawsuits against the jail. But I'm quite convinced with a department with 3,000 people, there will be enough individual problems so that nobody's going to be devoid of their right to say that something was done wrong. But at least on a global level, there can be addressing of these problems. That's one thing. The second thing is lawsuits. And the third thing is to raise hell, to do those things that citizens can do, to say, straighten up, fly right, change it, fix it, do the good thing.
Right, right.
And I can tell that you have the experience and desire to do that.
Go get them.
Anybody want to stand up for the poor sheriff who I've defamed here?
One thing I think of when I heard you is one of Malcolm Gladwell's latest books called Talking to Strangers. And it starts and ends with the Sandra Bland case, which is a perfect example of what you're talking about. Partly at the beginning, the misunderstanding between her and the guy that stopped her, and then the conditions in jail. Then in between are other cases, other situations, but it's
That's exactly right. One of the things I need to say, though, is this, because we've been doing these cases for 25 years. Many people who are working as deputy sheriffs or working in the jail, they're motivated by doing the right thing. The problem is they're asked as an institutional matter to do things that are far beyond their competence.
right.
A deputy sheriff is not a mental health expert. A deputy sheriff is not a drug counselor. A deputy sheriff is not somebody who is able to deal with the problems that actually involve most of the time.
Right.
And so what we need to do is to try to, instead of having every problem be defined as a nail, with the only solution being the hammer, is to understand that you can have a cadre of people who are psychiatric experts, who can go in the field and who have the ability to try to deal with de-escalation and deal with psychiatric problems. You can have people who are specialists in drug treatment, and instead of putting somebody in the jail to dry out for 8 or 10 hours, you put them in another facility where they may get some help. And so it's just a matter of trying to, and to a certain extent, the things that I've said are slightly unfair in that we're asking the institution of the sheriff's department to do the work that other institutions 40 years ago did. We had a state mental hospital. We had adequate funding. Now, the argument was you're putting too many people away, and just because somebody's a little quirky doesn't mean you have to commit them to a hospital. And so on that rationale, there was an agreement between civil libertarians and fiscal conservatives, which is, yeah, that's a good idea. Close the state mental hospitals. And the result we see is on the street in homelessness and in people who only come to our attention when they've reached a crisis point and a mental health tragedy.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have one more question? Okay, so then I think we can wrap this up, and thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Eugene Iredale, very much for this beautiful presentation.
Thank you all.
If we were in the faculty with club, you would see everybody clapping.
Very good.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to see everybody next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for putting it on.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Bye-bye.
Learned a lot. Thank you.